You're listening to Coffee Speak, a special kind of spotlight episode on the Coffee Podcast, featuring voices from coffee people around the world just like you. I'm Jesse Hartman. I want to clarify two things before we get this show on the road. The first thing, when I said coffee people just like you in the intro of this Coffee Speak episode, I do not mean to minimize the differences between people from every different kind of background, but rather emphasize the ground we share as humans, each of whom have inherent dignity and each of whom deserve respect. Second, I asked for feedback on Instagram last week, and I'm so thankful for the feedback I received. One of the feedback points was asking me to stay away from politics. While I appreciate that specific feedback, I find it impossible to separate the love of coffee from the love of people. And loving people has implications on how politics play out. This episode is a response to the Black Lives Matter movement, the murder of George Floyd and his brothers and sisters before him, and a call to action for all of us in coffee to stop and listen to the voices that have been crying out for centuries in our world and do something about the injustices they face.
My coffee, black and bold. I'm ready to go. Yeah, my coffee, black and mild. I'm still alive.
Who is Bartholomew Jones?
Bartholomew Jones is a guy from Memphis. I'm an educator and an MC, a coffee nerd. And I was born and raised here in Memphis, Tennessee, and went to college at Wheaton College right outside of Chicago. And outside, like in the Chicagoland area, is kind of where I got introduced to specialty coffee. But I fell in love with it when I moved back in Memphis at a local shop called Avenue Coffee. And me and my wife met, and she kind of pushed me to start brewing coffee at home. She bought me my first espresso machine.
Nice, yeah.
And we got married. We had kids, and I taught in the hood here for a while, and then just kind of really felt like I wasn't able to make the difference that I wanted to make, and so God opened the door for me to pursue my passion for music and coffee and education and social change all in one spot through Coffee Black. And so we just kind of been pushing with that for the last couple months.
Bartholomew is one of many voices on this episode. We will follow his story and experiences as a Black coffee professional, along with Lanisa, Steven, and Dre.
Hello, my name is Lanisa Williams. I'm the owner of Breeze for Life LA.
I'm Steven Zinnerman, co-owner and roaster of the Coffee Enthusiast, a brewing company here in Fayetteville, North Carolina. We were established in Woodland, New Jersey, in the metro Philadelphia area. And I run the company alongside my wife, Natasha. We're event-based, but we roast our own coffee as well. And we feature guest roasters from other specialty coffee companies from time to time.
Hello, humans behind the screen. My name is Dre Murray, and I am the owner of Black Gold Creative. I was a barista for a very, very short period of time, but I am still definitely a coffee enthusiast, as well as I began roasting this year, and it's something that I, definitely want to turn into an actual business in the near future.
The last 2 weeks have been very hard to digest. I can't really believe we're seriously in this quarantine. We have Black people getting killed daily and nobody's doing anything. This is crazy. The death of Mr. Floyd really impacted the whole world, and I hope it opens people's eyes and see this is how we've been treated. This is nothing new to us. The system needs to change. It definitely needs to change.
The last 2 weeks, with the murder of George Floyd and just everything that's been going on in this country has just been this emotional ride where I've been having every day just these very emotional conversations with friends of mine that grew up in environments that I grew up in that are Black, that have had this similar experience that I've had, and just talking about everything that comes with this experience and what we have seen and how we feel, and just talking through that, and then having conversations with my wife and talking through how we are going to talk about specific things, get detailed with our kids. And yeah, it's been this emotional ride.
These last 2 weeks have been tough, since the killing, the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. It's been tough because it just seems like it doesn't stop. And people just don't value us as African-American people.
The challenges of being Black in coffee brought up by Lanisa, Bartholomew, Stephen, and Dre all come from different individuals. But there are common threads that cannot be ignored.
The challenges that I have faced in coffee have been denied promotion, have been denied resources.
Coming into the specialty coffee industry, there have been a number of challenges. Main challenge is just access to, the things that we need. Having the funds to get certain things, like just simple stuff like equipment, proper grinders, proper brewing equipment.
Access to resources is one that we notice in the conversation. However, Lanisa uses that reality to fuel her passion for her community.
Like, that's what led me to want to venture out and create my own company to give people like me who may have a background or who may be Black and, don't know certain things. I want to be able to educate my people and uplift our community.
Dre tells us what it's like to be a Black coffee enthusiast, and he introduces another major theme I've heard through these conversations in the past few days.
One of the challenges as a coffee enthusiast is that you want to try out, many different, at least for me, I want to try out a lot of different coffee shops, whether it be out of town, whether it be in the place where I live, and there's, tons of coffee shops in an area where I can actually drive to, or places that I'm having meetings at, or whatever the case may be. And it's just this feeling of not being welcome, and the assumption that when I'm there that I don't know anything about coffee, specialty coffee, that, there's no way that I could be an enthusiast because of the color of my skin.
Shape-shifting as African-American people, we're not what people think of when it comes to the specialty coffee industry. So having to, in the beginning especially, shape-shift and try to find where you fit, and not seeing a lot of people of color, or especially Black people, because, people of color are not just Black people. You have Asians and Latinos and Pacific Islanders, everybody's in specialty coffee in some way, shape, form, or fashion. But seeing somebody from your community, from the African-American community, has been a challenge for us.
Imagine walking into a new coffee shop. You're excited to try that Gucci, but this is the experience you have.
Because you may not see as many Black enthusiasts in this area, just period, and so the challenge would be to find a space, especially like, being on the road, to find a space where I feel welcome, where I can actually sit down, have a discussion, and not feel like people are watching me because they feel as though I don't belong. There, been a lot of experiences where I've had that especially when I walk in by myself, where I don't feel welcome at all.
We are going to dive into a conversation with Bartholomew and talk in depth about his experiences and hopes and goals as a Black coffee professional. We will revisit Lanisa, Dre, and Stephen at the end of the conversation. You said your dad introduced you to coffee.
He did. My dad was like the first person to really talk to me about a single origin coffee.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. My dad was like the first person to talk to me about a single origin coffee. And I'm not sure how he got introduced to it, but his favorite coffee is Kenyan coffee. Um, and so he was. I remember being younger and him like going on and on about like Starbucks Kenyan
Nice.
coffee,
Okay.
and I just didn't like any coffee. I like frappuccinos at the time. Uh, and
Yeah.
so I don't know how he got introduced to it. I know he went to Kenya in college to study abroad, and then I also know like one of our good friends at our church is like a home roaster from California, and so like California has kind of been. He does like sweet Marias and stuff, so
Okay.
I know
Yeah.
he's been into specialty coffee for a minute. So maybe he got introduced to it through him. I'm not
Wow.
sure.
That would have been way ahead of the times as far as home roasting goes. You know, those Californians they were on the home roasting game early.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
they really were, man.
You also have some history in activism. Black Lives Matter is not a new movement to you in the least bit, obviously. What have you learned through your
Nah, not at all.
activism and protesting all these years?
So I would say first off that I would separate activism and protesting.
Okay. Yeah.
And the reason why I would do that is not to diminish either one, but just to say that like I think I did a lot of protesting that didn't really help
Oh,
anybody.
okay.
if that means anything, like so Memphis as in general is a kind of like a very blue collar town, and so like 2013 to 2016. I went to maybe like 8 or 9 protests. I would go to at least 3 or 4 a year, you know. So maybe it was more than 8 or 9, and you would see the same consistent people there over time. People like Tammy Sawyer, who've consistently been like a positive voice for the Black community, but the community at large was not really engaged with the protests, if that makes sense. So a guy named Darius Stewart was shot in Memphis, Tennessee during that time, and he was an unarmed Black male shot in the back. I think it was 3 times, and he was actually shot on church ground out in the ex-Bourbon. Ex-Bourbon is just like a suburb that recently has experienced white flight, and so has a lot more diversity there now. So yeah, he was shot by a police officer named Connor Schilling, and we did a lot of protesting, and I didn't organize it. I was attending, supporting, and you know, it was just really, really hard to get people engaged in the process. And so during this time I'm teaching, and I'm like, how can I communicate this to my students? And, you know, you can't convince students, 8th graders, to come to a protest, but I also couldn't convince like young adults, old adults. It was just really hard, man. It was like organizing is really hard. And Tammy Sawyer recently just had a mayoral bid here in the city, and she had to, she did not win, unfortunately, but even during that process, man, like she's been consistently supporting the Black community here for, I don't know how many years, to her own detriment. She's had threats against her life several times. And even in the midst of that, like, she still didn't have all the support that she needed, right? And there's still people who don't even know who she is, who are in need in communities. And so activism, you know, our goal is to build up our communities, protect our communities, empower our communities. But I think when you go to a protest, the actual impact of that protest is sometimes way smaller than what you want it to be. And that's honestly what pushed me away from going to as many protests as I did and trying to figure out, okay, how can I have a bigger impact and actually create some of the results that I want to see happen from this protest. And so that pushed me more into education. It pushed me more into like Black business and being able to like own property and employ people, teach people the skills to employ themselves. And also just to do good business with people so that we are not in places where people don't want us to be, and then we end up with our lives in danger. Because one thing I consistently notice, man, is like every time we're killed, we're on someone else's land, you know, and I think America makes it abundantly clear that they don't want us here. And so they don't want us on their property. They don't want us on things that they don't even own, public property. You know what I mean? And so like, it's like, yo, we have to start building up barriers between ourselves and the people who would want to do harm to us. And I think a big part of that is like just ownership, property ownership, business ownership. It creates kind of a buffer in a safe zone, a safe space, without that you don't have to ask permission for. You know what I mean?
Frankly, yeah. I was going to say, frankly, I don't know what you mean. You're teaching me things right now, and I'm learning from you.
Okay.
That's nothing I was aware of, frankly. That was
Yeah, man. So the Black Lives Matter movement has done so much good work, and they've worked so hard, and there's still so much to do over this time. I think the Ferguson movement, which I don't know if it predated the Black Lives Matter movement or if they kind of coalesced around the same time, but they're definitely contemporaries. And you look at all the work that went in with all the grassroots people who organized in Ferguson during that time, and a lot of my friends from college who did like racial education work, racial reconciliation work. We did a lot of that work in college on campus through student organizations. Those people went down to Ferguson. I was teaching at the time, but like they went and lived in Ferguson.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So one of the frustrating things I remember is them saying like, hey, man, we don't have money for food because we're not working while we're protesting, right? You're just organizing, but you still need money. And I remember feeling like, man, I don't make enough money as a teacher to support the things that I want my students, the things that I feel like will protect my students. And so like that was, again, one of those small things that made me want to move into more for-profit work, where I can start to control more of those variables. But yeah, it was crazy, man. Like I've noticed so much of the work that they've done, and there's so much more to do. Two people who were big and influential in that movement, in the like Ferguson and Black Lives Matter movement, were DeRay and Netta, who I shouted out in a song that nobody will probably ever hear because we never released it anywhere but SoundCloud. but they're two people who were really inspiring to me, seeing their work on the ground. And they made, at least I know DeRay did, try to transition, I believe, in Baltimore to running for public office so he can make more consistent policy change. Because at some point, every person who's interested in protest, I say it like this, in my opinion, protesting is a lever. And so it's something that can be used to leverage public outrage for a particular policy good. Or it can be used as a baton and you can just beat against a cause with it. You know what I mean? But when you look at how much damage you can do to a wall with a lever versus a baton, the lever's going to win every time. And so like most people, as they do these protests, they realize it's really difficult to walk and chant and then create a long-term change from that. You know what I mean? There has to be, once you get people's attention, there has to be a certain amount of organization,
strategy,
and specificity into what needs to happen, and strategy. And so I said this today in a live. I said Dr. King was arrested over 30 times during his time as a civil rights activist. And you ask the question, well, what was his job and how did he use his money to pay his bond? Like, who paid Dr. King's bond? Well, it was the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council. They paid his bond, right? Because they had a bail bond fund. How was the bail bond funded if the SCLC was a nonprofit? That meant there were Black businesses and entrepreneurs who consistently made income and fed into that, right? And so there's an ecosystem necessary to allow activists, to allow political organizers, to allow protesters to be able to move sustainably. Other questions, I'm not going to get into all of them, but just like, who took care of his kids? Who made sure his wife was okay? Who protected their home from like further aggression? Like all of those things are things that like kind of at a certain point you realize you have to think about it. And we're in a place right now where we're protesting and putting flyers on Facebook, which is dope. But when we know we live in a world where COINTELPRO, which was the CIA's surveillance program on civil rights activists, we know that's a real thing, right? We know that they really had plants. They paid people to go and spy and pretend to be like down for the cause in order to get information and to lie or to plant bugs in people's homes. We know that's a historical thing, right? So how much more easy is that to do in a world where everyone has social media and people can turn your camera on in your phone? So like there's even, you could argue, a larger need for more actual organization around like activism now as opposed to in the past. So that's why I say I kind of separate protesting and activism, because protesting is a tool that activists use, but it's really a very specific tool. It's not necessarily the encompassing part of activism. Like Tammy Sawyer spends most of her time on the city commission board, who, I mean, that would be the activist who I respect the most in the city. And she spends most of her time in front of the city commission listening to boring meetings. You know what I mean? It's not sexy. It's not cool. You can't take an Instagram picture of that.
Definitely not sexy.
But it's activism, right? Yeah, I spent a lot of time as an educator, like fighting for education reform. That's activism, but it wasn't cool sitting in like school board meetings. You know what I mean? Or arguing about curriculum pacing. but it was necessary because those were the things that would long-term affect good. And then there are these moments where everything coalesces and we do have these nationwide protests. And so the things are intertwined, but they're also separate. I don't know if that actually answers your question.
You know what? It's not about answering my question. My questions are there as sort of a roadmap. So wherever we go, that's okay.
Yeah.
Totally fine.
It's a vibe. I'm with it, bro. I'm with it.
I do have a question for you. Out of what you've been saying, do you consider coffee black? So your coffee company, your brand, do you consider that a lever?
Yeah, at the end of the day, for sure. Like my dream is to build Tinder for Black businesses, and so I can explain what I want to do with that. But like, coffee is the second largest industry in the world. Like, it's $100 billion industry, second only to oil, right? As far as the revenue it produces, and it's hilarious because coffee is the same color of oil, but it's nowhere near as useful. You know what I mean? Like, you can't propel someone through the air with
We
coffee.
could try. I bet you James Hoffman could pull that off.
We could, right? He probably could. Hoffman's the man. I need to send him some of my music, right? Yeah, like, I think the goal here is to say this industry is, and I learned this from a lady who owns a shop called Coffee and Mikate in Toronto, or somewhere in Canada, and she's a Congolese woman who explicitly sells Congolese coffee in her shop. And she told me, she was like, coffee is this $100 billion industry. Do you know what else is $100 billion? She was like, it was the world, I think it was the World Relief Fund or some fund that was available to do like relief work. She was like, we don't need people to spend this money in our community when the money doesn't circulate. Like, if we could actually take like 10% of the ownership of this industry, we could eliminate the need for this relief work. And so her dream was to see more Black people and brown people who are creating. In her community, she's Black, so she's thinking about Black people in her country growing their coffee, but also owning or having ownership or having a stake in the export and the retail sales of their coffee.
Like vertically integrating,
generating a coffee industry within the. And some people say this fourth wave coffee, fifth wave. I don't know what wave we're at right now, to be honest with you. I don't really care. Like, as long as people aren't drowning, I think that's kind of my biggest goal. And so, like, that's what we want to see. Is we want to see Black people who are in America, the UK, wherever, able to do business with other Black people who are in like Cauca in Colombia, or who are in Ethiopia or Rwanda. And so the dream for this app or this infrastructure is essentially like Black families can start businesses. And then they can put their profile, who they are, what they want to do, their values, kind of how much coffee they're looking to spend. And then they can look and browse through the profiles of these farmers and producers and swipe up, or swipe left, whatever you swipe. I got married before Tinder was cool, so I'm not exactly sure how it goes, but like, you swipe some direction. And then if that family looks at you and says, hey, we agree with them, we like them, maybe we have the same religious beliefs, maybe we have the same amount of little girls, like whatever, they find some type of connection and they want to do good business with them, they can swipe too. And then we would have the infrastructure to allow them to set up and schedule a FaceTime call, and then some infrastructure to hold and store some of their coffee where we can ship it quickly to other people. And so I don't know how Coffee Black gets you there, but that's eventually what I want to be able to do, because I think that us taking ownership over the things that we produce, I mean, that's kind of the whole point of the shirt that we created. It was like, we want people to love Black people like they love Black coffee. And I think the amount of investment in money and resources that go into just Black exports in general, whether it be money or whether it be coffee, and this is true for indigenous people as well, right? Like, the things that these people produce oftentimes are more heavily invested in the individual communities themselves.
Very much so in coffee.
If we can do a little bit of that, I think that's kind of like what Coffee Black wants to do,
I really like what you did there. We were talking about what wave are we in? And you said something along the lines of, as long as nobody's drowning. And so that imagery there I felt like really powerful. There could be a lyric or something at some point. Yeah. If it's not already.
Yeah, man. It needs to, we put it in. So we got so much music on deck right now. I'm like,
exciting.
I just want to release it the right way. But man, it's a lot. Right now I got to go make 500.
I know. Yeah. We'll talk about that in a second.
That's going to be this weekend.
So,
right.
I was going to talk about Gucci. You seem to have a good, deep love for some Gucci.
Gucci.
I do. No, I was just saying, yeah.
Yeah,
I
you definitely do.
do.
I mean, the freestyle that you have, I'll play a clip too, a little bit of the freestyle clip here. What
Okay.
inspired the Gucci freestyle? I mean, what's your fascination with Gucci? Was it like the coffee that got you into specialty coffee, or?
So actually, the coffee that really people call it like the dragon, chasing the dragon. At least our coffee community calls it that here in Memphis. But the dragon for me was a Burundi that I had an espresso inside of like a short latte, and it tastes like strawberry milk. And
Yeah.
I was like, "Did y'all put flavoring in this?" And they're like, "No, we didn't." So that definitely blew me away. Gucci for me it just became this fascination with the coffee, and I have no earthly idea why, bro. Like I can't tell you why. But like I just started. It was hot outside. I really wanted a flash brew. I decided, okay, I don't really mess with cold brew like that. So I wanted something cold. And I remember again at Avenue Coffee, I had a flash brew of their Gucci that they were selling from Reverb Coffee Roasters, and it like blew my mind, bro. And I like
so good.
There's a video on YouTube where I'm just like freaking out about it, man. And so that for me really turned into this fascination. Anytime I saw a Gucci anywhere, I was getting it. And you know, me and the homies were in the studio working on a project that we did called On the Spot. So it was like a series of 12 songs where we did an impromptu improvised hip hop song with live instrumentation. Wow. And so we did this for 12 weeks in a row. And so me and my DJ, he used to DJ for 8Ball and MJG, who were kind of like historic rap legends in the city. And so he's really into coffee though. And so we're both like going to like the bougie coffee shop, you know, in the middle of the gentrified neighborhood to get our coffee. And they're cool people. And they were like, hey, here's the coffee, right? But like it was just a weird setting change. Actually, funny story. They were one of the first shops to carry Gucci Mane. So shout out to City State here in Memphis. But like, yeah, we went to that shop and we were like, the setting is such a stark contrast between here and now we're recording in the studio and there's weed all in the walls. Not like weeds, but like the smell of weed is all in the walls, and we're rapping and like making this soul music. And it was just there was like a dissonance there. And so there was a desire, because we are musicians, to resolve that dissonance.
Okay.
You know what I mean? To create some type of harmony. And so my DJ just out of nowhere, his name is Matt Majors, we call him M3. He was like, yo, what if we came out with a coffee and called it Gucci Mane? And we just started dying in the studio. But I had already we had started Coffee Black a couple months before that. And it was kind of me putting out educational information, doing like apparel and things like that. And then of course we had the music. So it was more like a lifestyle brand than it was we didn't sell an actual coffee. And I wasn't a roaster, so it was just an idea. But I met a roaster, long story short, because I know we got a lot of things to get to, but he was talking to, he had sent some coffee to a local hip hop artist, indie hip hop artist I follow that's still in Chicago called Stevie G. And I was like, yo, I've seen rappers get like clothing care packages. I've seen them get like weed care packages. Yeah. You know, I've seen them get I've never seen a rapper get a coffee care package. And so I had to like, you know, go down that rabbit trail. It turns out the roaster, his name was Kenny, and he had a company called Ethnos Coffee, and he had just moved back to Memphis because he actually grew up here.
Okay.
And so I was working at a skate park coffee shop combo at the time called Society Memphis. And he came by, and he had a Gucci that he was really excited about. And so that was the first coffee that became Gucci Mane. And he still roasts for us today. Like, he's our roaster. His name is Kenny Baker, and he's the only white guy on the team too. So shout out to white allies with the homie Kenny.
Right up, and our listeners can go, I assume, and go to your website and buy some Gucci Mane right now. Is that right? All right.
Yes, they can. Yes,
hey, you got to plug it.
We got like 132 pounds left. So yeah, man, they can go get it while we got it. We're sourcing some new Gucci at the moment. So
I'm gonna sober up the questions a little bit. We're gonna start getting into the heavy stuff here. You know, I'm gonna take a moment to address the specialty coffee sector specifically here. This is a sector in the industry that sits in a seat of applause for what they do for marginalized people around the world. And I want to ask you, as a Black coffee professional, what do you think about the quote-unquote progress the specialty sector has promoted? Do you think that celebration of progress is warranted?
I'm going to be 100%
please,
frank.
Yeah, please be.
I don't. Yeah, I don't. So when you ask me what do I think about specialty coffee, I don't think about specialty coffee. Like I really don't. Like there's there's this thing, proximity to whiteness, right? It's a term that means basically there's a certain amount of whiteness,
Okay.
proximity to whiteness. And so the whole concept of this like sociological term is just that there's accolades and monetary value. So like you got quantitative and qualitative value that comes in a white supremacist power structure or society from one's proximity to whiteness. And so even if you are not white, if you are able to approximate it to some degree, you benefit yourself.
Okay.
And you receive benefits from the white
Okay,
power
that makes
structure.
sense to me. Yeah.
So yeah, the whole point of Coffee Black is me trying to liberate myself from the white power structure, right? So it's trying to say, okay, I don't necessarily want to depend on the approval of white people or really anything that has to do with white people for my income base. So, like, of course, there are white people who agree with what we're doing, but our whole goal was like, man, how can we create something that's purely for the benefit of our communities? Because at the end of the day, the feeling is we're all we have, you know? And I think this most recent institution or situation has been really surprising because way more people have come out in support of George Floyd than I think any other instance that I can think of in recent history, which is encouraging. But there's a certain, I guess, pessimism that I have, which is that at some point that support will wane, and then we'll need to have our own systems and support for ourselves. And so I don't really think about the specialty coffee industry. And so I guess that in a roundabout way says, I guess I don't believe what they think about themselves, but I'm also not really concerned with what they think about themselves because I'm more concerned about like how many black farmers can I buy coffee from? And then how many black people can I sell that coffee to? Like that's what I think about most of the time. And I try to cater our events and our actual income stream to facilitate a life where we can flourish without proximity to whiteness. You know what I mean? And so like one of my big goals is like I try to totally deconstruct and decolonize coffee when I present it to my community. So we do these monthly, well now we don't because of Corona, but before Corona we were doing these monthly coffee classes called Brew Up, which is like a coffee cipher. And I don't say anything about the specialty coffee industry when I do it. You know what I mean? Like I don't think about the specialty coffee industry, not because they're not human beings made in God's image and they don't have value, but because that's not who's there. Like they're never gonna, I don't want to say never, but like we're in Memphis, Tennessee. This is where Martin Luther King got shot. 3-6 Mafia wrote, "Pop in my collar." Like I just don't see tons of, you know, specialty coffee professionals moving here or flocking here or trying to build establishments here. Mostly what happens though is that the people who live here are at risk of being pushed out by the specialty coffee industry. So I guess if I do have an opinion is that I really am curious to know what specialty coffee thinks about black people. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm.
Frankly, I'm going to ask you first, is this an ignorant question? Is there an opportunity for the specialty coffee sector to change? Or is it kind of beside the point for you?
It kind of is beside the point. I mean, we say no sugar, no cream for a reason, right? Like, it's kind of like we're really, really focused on even the name Gucci Mane and the fact that we only sell one specific origin of coffee from one specific black part of the world is to be really hyper focused on one thing and just communicating that thing really, really, really well. And at some point, I'm sure we'll do more. But like my whole point is like trying to communicate one thing really, really well and really, really unequivocally, so that it can be understood. For me, if I had to get out of my personal interest and just give like an observer's opinion, I think that the usefulness of specialty coffee or the specialty coffee industry to black community is 100% tied up in or dependent upon their willingness to recognize the value of the black community outside of its cultural export.
Wow. Okay.
And so, I can't necessarily measure whether someone or an industry is willing to do that. What I can do is look at their marketing. I talked about this on a previous podcast with some homies here in the city. But I was
here,
like,
please.
What I can do is look at the marketing, the marketing tactics, right? And so when I do look at the marketing tactics, and who the demographic that specialty coffee tends to cater towards is not really the people who grow their coffee or the types of people who grow their coffee or the race of people who grows their coffee or races. It's generally toward affluent millennial white
Hmm.
people. When I look at contactless payment options and Edison lights and minimalism, something about that doesn't make me think hip hop. It also doesn't make me think Central America or Indonesia.
Hmm.
The aesthetic very much so is one that markets toward a certain philosophical and I would even say aesthetic viewpoint. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
I hear
so
you. Yeah.
it's speaking to a certain group of people and it's speaking that this is for them, even if people would necessarily say like, hey, we want anybody to come in our shop. Like that's not who you're marketing towards. I've been focused a lot on Facebook ads over the last couple of months because I think it's a big tool for specifically people who don't have access to privilege to still generate income. Because I mean, Facebook, you can reach anybody in the world and nobody needs to know who you are. They don't ever see your face necessarily. And so,
Yeah.
demographics are interesting things, man, and looking at which ads respond well with different demographics. And I see a consistent branding narrative, in third wave coffee, right? Which is marketing towards a certain individual. And then even the people of color who are a lot of times found in those spaces, myself being one of which, there's a certain level of assimilation that's not expected, but that I think makes sense in the branding. Like the aesthetic would kind of not look right if you were to take the aesthetic that's found in a lot of the communities that coffee shops move into and apply that to their coffee shop. It would clash. And so a lot of times what I see specialty coffee spaces doing is like unconsciously seeking to modify the aesthetic or the narrative of the neighborhood to fit the coffee shop, as opposed to making your coffee shop fit the narrative of the neighborhood.
Okay. Yeah. A little bit. That's backwards.
Yeah. I think that might illuminate. Yeah. You know what I mean? So you come into a neighborhood and are upset that there are homeless people around, but they were here before you.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? These people were here before you and their grandparents were probably here before you. And then you're frustrated that they want to pay you in nickels and dimes. But again, this was the economic system that was here before you were here. They don't have a cell phone. They don't have a Cash App or, Apple Pay or whatever. And then some people do have Apple Pay, but I think having options is important, right? And specifically paying attention to and listening to the neighborhood prior to moving in the neighborhood, and even asking them, do you want us in this neighborhood? Are questions that if someone is genuine, they'll take the time to listen to. But I think when people are primarily interested in themselves, it's hard to ask that group of people, hey, do you care about what we think about you, when there was no time really taken to establish any rapport in the first place, So, most Black people don't know what specialty coffee is, and they don't really care to know because they can get coffee from other places. Specialty coffee is, at the end of the day, composed of human beings, and human beings have the potential to generate enormous value, especially when we invest in each other.
Yeah.
And so I think the human beings that compose the specialty coffee industry have the ability to do a tremendous amount of good if they were to invest in and build authentic relationships with the individuals that make up the neighborhoods they move in, or the places where they source their coffee from, or any of those
You
things.
touched on this already. Coffee shops have a history of being an initial marker for gentrification. What's your vision for Coffee Black with that reality in mind?
Yeah, well, I think intentionally right now we're not a shop, and I don't ever plan on becoming a shop until after I built this Tinder for Black businesses or whatever. And so we're a social enterprise. Primarily, we do educational classes, and then the model that I have is that our apparel and coffee basically is our nonprofit, quote unquote, funding for the work that I want to do in the community. And so instead of because I was in nonprofit, I got my master's degree here in the city, and I got my bachelor's out in Chicago, and all of that work was in social work, education reform, sociology. And so, like, as I'm doing these things and then working with activists here in the city and doing activism work myself, you end up begging old white dudes for money a lot. And that's kind of like weird.
Yeah.
You know what
I can imagine.
Like, you end up asking a lot of, it's kind of a weird and demeaning thing. And then you get asked to present, well, let me see the effectiveness of your business, or excuse me, of your program, because you're never running a business, you're running a 501c3. And that's kind of a weird thing too, because it's like, well, let me see your effectiveness. You know what I mean? Like, I assume I would know more about how to do this than you do.
Yeah, especially with your
and if you're
your
interested
background,
in doing it, yeah, I'm from here, right? So, but you end up having to prove your own ability to affect good in your community. And then the fund comes out in these meager ways, and there's stipulations about how you have to use it. And so kind of my vision for Coffee Black was like, okay, so what if we just had our own products that we sold for a profit, and then we can use our money however I'm not going to curse, but you know what I mean? You can use your money however you want.
I know what you were
it.
saying.
You know what I mean? And it is only you and God who can determine how it gets used, right? And those are the only, God and my wife, I guess, those are the only individuals I feel, and my mom, that I have to answer to. And so as long as I'm doing those people, one of my favorite MCs, his name is KB, and he said, Jesus happy and my wife love me, is nothing left to conform to.
Oh, dang.
And
I
so
like
for me, I think that those things, yeah. So it's like, well, I guess the point is Coffee Black was created to be his own financial engine for doing social good. And so we have like the Gucci Mane line of coffee. We have our Brew Culture apparel, which is like a series of pieces of apparel that make these social statements or educational statements. And then we have the music, and then all those things fund the educational work, like the podcast and the monthly coffee educational classes. And then a lot of the behind the scenes work we do as far as like teaching young entrepreneurs how to start their own businesses, how to build a Shopify store, how to create a product. Like those are things that we do. And I don't have to ask for permission or get someone's approval or show them, our numbers, quote unquote, in order to do that, because I'm not asking for anyone else's funds, right? I'm just in the marketplace exchanging a product I have for value or financial value.
I want to jump into your music a little bit. Actually, first, can you tell me, what is a Popeye's chicken effect? Because this may not end up on the episode, but I heard you mention it, and I was like, what is that?
Right. On the podcast.
Yeah.
Okay, so and this gets to the point that I actually wanted to talk
perfect.
about. Right? So I hope it doesn't end up on the podcast. So in the line of you saying, like, what is our vision for Coffee Black in the neighborhood, right? Like, our goal is to actually meet the neighborhood on equal footing and then say, hey, let us introduce you to this product, and we want you to introduce us to you, and we're going to discover it together from the ground up. From like, what is it? We just ask questions, and then the community prepares a list of questions, and then we make future classes, or it's basically like a coffee cipher.
Okay.
They're all kind of based around these essential questions that people have. And so the next question people have is like, hey, what is a washed coffee and what's a natural coffee?
I got you.
So that's what we were scheduled to discuss next. Because previously we had been talking about that, and people were like, well, what's the difference? And another question we had was like, what's the difference between good coffee and cheap coffee? Like we want to provide quality coffee to Black people, but we also want to provide affordable coffee. And are those two things necessarily contradictory? Are they mutually unacceptable?
Good question. Yeah. Wow.
Right. And the community brought that question up. And so awesome. As we're discussing it, people generally feel like they have to pick one or the other. But anyway, so these are the questions the community's asking, right? And so we're building our whole educational curriculum around these questions that they're asking. As we're going through this process of doing it with the community starts to determine what things will look like. They're like, we curate playlists. We bring a DJ from the community who plays this music. And so and we sell our products to the community there too, right? So we're providing an actual service and good in the community too. We're not just asking people to show up and, just be there, right? It's a dignified exchange. And so the Popeye's chicken effect connects to this because a lot of times there's this belief, especially when you move into an industry, that you have to have the approval of that industry in order to participate in the goods that industry sells. But when you recognize that many of the industries that exist currently are built on stolen goods. Speaking of George Floyd, they're built on looting. You know what I mean? They're built on things that have been looted from society, either intellectual property or actual property. Yeah. When you look at like a lot of these museums or coffee or things like that, things that were literally stolen, right? Those people didn't receive the permission of that community before they stole it or approximated their intellectual property or stole their physical property. They just took it and then saw that it had an inherent value, because that's everything that God makes, we believe, has value. And so you don't have to necessarily respect it in order to access it, unfortunately. And so what we believe is the Popeye's chicken effect simply says that Popeye's introduced a product and use the inherent value of the Black community to market and make that product profitable,
okay.
like
I
extremely
see.
profitable. And so what we're saying is people use this effect against our community or at the cost of our community. And it's something that actually could be used to benefit our community because of the tremendous cultural capital that the Black community has worldwide in the diaspora. Like when we think something is cool, a lot of times it's just cool or valuable. A lot of times it becomes valuable in the marketplace. So we should use those things for our own products.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of the whole point, right? And we would say, like, I would say, tapping or circling back to what do I think about the specialty coffee industry, you know, the specialty coffee industry would do well. The individuals who make it, they would do well, not only spiritually and morally, but I also believe financially, to sit down with Black communities they're going in and say, hey, what are some products you would like to have? Like, what are you, if we did a space like this, what would you be looking for in this space? Because people will spend that money.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? People will spend the money and give you that. Because Popeyes had the chicken sandwich for months. I had actually tried it, and I forgot months before it went viral. But when the Black community began to significantly invest in that with their time and attention, the product's marketability went through the roof.
Yeah.
And so the value of their product went through the roof. And that's because people found something there that they thought was interesting to them. And so, you know, my proposition is just like to individuals who partake in Black products or Black exports, like you actually have more financial gain there's more financial gain to be had by actually investing and growing with the Black community as opposed to taking the products and selling them in spite of the Black community. You know what I mean? Like, because now they're participating in this economy for you and with you. And that's just to me, that's just a better, that's a better financial decision.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. I wanted to dive into your song, Coffee Black. What's a line from the song that really stands out for you personally?
I think there are two lines from the song Coffee Black, as in my coffee black and bold. Yeah, on that song, there are two lines that stand out to me. One is, my coffee black and mild, I'm still alive. And the second one is, God brewed my coffee black, the whole pot. So I'll get into one and then the second one. The juxtaposition between bold and mild, I think, was something that was, I think, a generic term that I heard when I was, a child learning about coffee, or even when I was curious about coffee. These terms, bold or mild or light roast, things like that, were terms that were thrown around a lot. But as I've grown in coffee, and I'm sure most people in third wave coffee would agree, like, those are not actual flavor markers. You know what I mean? How do you determine the quote unquote boldness of something? You can't. And I think of that parallel but it's still something that people desire, even though it's not something that can really be quantified. And I think that parallel is something that happens to Black males and Black women as well. Black trans people, like all Black people, you have this experience where there is a certain amount of, I guess you can say, viscosity that is expected of Black individuals. There's a certain amount of jazz people expect to get from you when they interact with you. There's an aggression they expect for you to have. My wife has shared this with me plenty of times as a Black woman, like how people expect her to be angry or aggressive. And, we see that in the media too, where like plenty of Black individuals, like there's almost this expectation that there's going to be some type of sass or attitude or bite to the individual, as well as in a negative and positive sense, right? Where people expect it for their entertainment. People expect it also when it comes to their own safety, and it makes them feel endangered, which is kind of an interesting thing when you just analyze that. Like, there's a certain fetish. There's a fetish there. You know what I mean? Of like, oh, this person's angry and aggressive, they're dangerous, but it also is fascinating to me, and I kind of want to be around it. And none of those things are necessarily true or untrue. Like, you cannot really quantify the boldness of something, and yet it's something that's to be expected. And at the end of the day, the first line I say is that my coffee's black and bold, I gotta go. And I think at the end of the day, it causes us to be projected or expelled from a lot of the things or places where we seek to find community.
Okay.
Even though it's the thing a lot of times that draws us into that community or that makes people desire us, it also makes them spit us out or add sugar and cream into it to change the flavor of it. So people want bold coffee, but they want bold coffee to put sugar and cream in, which is kind of crazy to think about in the first place. Like if you want this flavor in the coffee only to then dilute that flavor, did you really ever want that flavor in the first place? If we can call bold a flavor. And so thinking about that as a person, right, if you want this quality in me as a large black man to be aggressive and lumbering and ignorant and kind of buffoonish, and then when I present those qualities, or if I were to present those qualities, it would cause you then to spit me out or try to change me or reject me. Like it's the line. My coffee's black and bold, and then I have to go. But if I were to then succumb to the changes that you then require of me once you want me to be bold, if I become black and mild, which is also like a self-medicating drug or self-medicating herb that a lot of people use. I don't know if you heard of black and milds, but you know, people in the neighborhood growing up used to always smoke black and milds just to let the stress down a little bit. If I were to move in that process myself, then the only real goal that I get is that I get to live, but I don't get a chance to flourish. You know what I mean? I can still stay alive. I can avoid the aggression that's put upon quote unquote bold black people historically. But the only benefit is that I'm still alive. I don't really get to retain my true qualities or my true essences that the Creator has given me. I don't ever really get to fully be myself or be a fully realized human being. I just become a facsimile of whatever people's hazelnut preference is
hazelnut
at the time.
Preference, yeah. That's a nice touch.
Yeah, and so like that line, yeah, bro. I mean, I've been thinking about it for a long time.
It's
right?
clear,
So, like,
yeah. The lyrics are powerful.
Those lines are, yeah, man. Those lines are really powerful to me because that's a constant struggle. Those two lines. I don't know if there's ever a time when I really get them, but the line "God brewed my coffee black," the whole pot. To me, is just saying every piece of me, whether you were to quantify it as bold, even though that's not necessarily. I mean, at the end of the day, bro, blackness is not a real thing. It's a social construct. That was placed upon people from the continent of Africa who happen to share a varying shade of brown, but were from thousands of different cultures and thousands of different people groups and spoke thousands of different languages. You know what I mean? And thousands of different tribes. It was a thing that was made up and yet has real consequences. And that's the same thing, you know, that's a synonym, I would suppose, of boldness, is that it's a thing that's made up, but it has real consequences on how people approach coffee itself. And it also has real consequences on how people treat black people. But even in that, every particular piece of me, whether people perceive it to be real or not, is a part of God's plan for my life. And so I choose to embrace those things and give the final authority or the final Q grading score up to the Messiah, as opposed to any particular race of man or human being who would like to have some type of input on, you know, how I'm quote unquote supposed to taste.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Well, we're coming down to the last few minutes here. I want to ask you two questions, but I have to choose one. So the one that I don't ask you, I'm going to ask you off the mic, and I'll read it for my listeners. So the one I'm going to read is, how can the coffee community, our listeners, support the Black Lives Matter movement and not just be word spreaders? I'm going to ask you that one off the air. I'll have you write it and I'll read it. Or I'll have you send me audio if you want. But I noticed you were talking about Dr. King, and I want to take a moment to honor him on the podcast. I've been reading Radical King. It's written by his hand, and it's really opened my eyes. And I notice you speak a lot about King in your when you speak about the oppression of the black community. And what is it about King that you admire the most, like today?
Man, I think for me at this point is his belief in the resurrection. And what I mean by that is simply his conviction that death was not a final barrier in his people's progression towards their destiny given to them by their Creator. And death historically has been a weapon that, I mean, has been weaponized, right? It's been used to, the scriptures that I believe in say that, you know, fear of death leads to slavery. And so I believe it's in the book of Ephesians. And so the idea here is that the fear of death or the threat of death has been used to get people to compromise their dignity historically. And what I love about Dr. King is that his belief in the resurrection, both physical and spiritual, allowed him to present a fully realized humanity and dignity in the face of the threat of death. And I think, to me, that is something that I want to pass to my children and to my students and to the future generations, is that collectively they cannot kill our dignity, right?
Yeah.
You can technically kill my body, but you can't kill my soul.
Right.
And I think that people think when people read King, he gets portrayed as a coward.
Not at all.
Actually, his actual actions were the opposite,
Yeah.
right? With the country killed him for a reason. They hated him just like they hated Malcolm. And in our branding, we honor Malcolm as well, right? We put an X in our name for a reason, to honor the Nation of Islam's naming practice of removing the slave name that was given. But I think those two people are hand in hand for me, Malcolm and Martin. And I think there's a duality in the experience of all individuals. You move between those two places. But for King, for me, I quote him a lot, and I like to quote his quotes that are not quoted often, if that makes sense. I like to quote his lesser-known speeches, and I like to read his lesser-known books, because I think that in that place you find a reality that honestly speaks to the whole of the experience and doesn't just address these little niceties. And I think King's courage was what allowed him to address the spiritual part of humanity and Black humanity, as well as the physical part and the militant part and the societal part of Black humanity. He addressed it all, and I will always and forever respect that man. And he wasn't perfect, you know what I mean? Like, you know, his infidelity to his wife is something that's frequently brought up, and he was a flawed man. But I think even in that, there's a lesson to us all that no matter how well you'll be remembered by history, like, the way you treat those closest to you is what matters the most. And so there's a certain amount of integrity that we need to hold in that as well.
Well, man, I want to thank you for coming on the show, for sharing with us, for allowing us an opportunity to hear from you as a Black person in the community. And
if there's one book I can recommend, if there's one book I can recommend, it's a book by John Perkins, and it's called Restoring At-Risk Communities. John Perkins was actually someone who marched with Dr. King. And these are radical things, but these are things that I can recommend my family has done. I would challenge people, individuals, because I can't speak to an industry, but I can speak to human beings in the industry. I would challenge them, if you're interested, there are three things that John Perkins recommends. One, he recommends relocation. Two, he recommends reconciliation. And three, he recommends redistribution. And I don't have time to get into all those things at the moment, but those are things my wife and I have chosen to do and build our business model around. We purchased a home in the hood. We just recently purchased another lot of land in that hood, and we're building our business there. But I would encourage, if you're white and you want to join the struggle for liberation in Black peoples, then I would encourage you to do as many of those three R's as possible. And everybody's not always going to be able to do all three, but consider relocating, consider reinvesting and redistributing what wealth you do have, and consider what true reconciliation would look like.
There are hints of change, as Stephen points out, and hopes for change from Stephen, Dre, and Lanisa.
But also to see certain people become aware or wake up, so to speak, and begin to want to know and begin to want to support and help people all over the world. I'm seeing it, all over the world, showing support. For one, I hope that sticks, and I hope that it's something that continues, because you know how the news cycle is, unfortunately. And I just hope that even when this isn't, and other stories that have happened, when this isn't on the news every day anymore, that this is still something that sticks, and that people are actually moving forward in that way, wanting to learn, wanting to help. And then for me personally, just learning more about my local government and how I can actually, I convey some of this stuff in my art, but how I can actually help to improve the civic side of things where I live. So that, tragic situation, but I'm hoping that we can move forward in a positive direction.
Things are starting to change. So we see a lot more African American people in the specialty coffee industry in different positions other than just baristas. That was a challenge at one point. You could be a barista or a shift manager, or maybe a store manager, but you have to work like crazy just to prove that you're worthy of that position. And a lot of times because you are black, I remember working for or wanting to work for a coffee shop here in North Carolina at one point, and they don't think that I realized it, but they did not think that I was the ideal person. That I didn't have the look of a specialty coffee employee. So what they did was, they let me work outside in the farmers market.
Anything that I could leave with the audience is give people a chance. Don't judge a book by its cover. There's opportunity in everybody. Like, someone gave me a second chance and changed my whole life. Like, I highly suggest that you give Black people an opportunity in the coffee community. Like, we definitely have a place there, and a lot of us here are here to claim it.
One thing that I want you to take away from this is that race as an idea, like, we are one race. We are all humans, but we all have different experiences. Your experience is different than mine. My experience is different than yours. Like, we see things differently. We have different perspectives on certain things. But at the end of the day, there is a truth out there, and a lot of things that we've been taught, that you may have been taught, a lot of things that we pick up on at a young age when we're very impressionable, and we take with us into adulthood. A lot of things you're going to have to unlearn and really knock down and rebuild. A lot of ideas that you've been given may not be true. A lot of stories that you've been told just are not true. And, the internet can have its downfalls. But what I really appreciate about the internet is that, yes, you can find a lot of bad information, but there are a lot of creators, a lot of people creating content, with references to where you can actually fact check this stuff. There are a lot of creators creating content that debunk some of these stories that we've heard as children that we think are true, that are taught in our schools about certain groups, certain organizations, and how situations that Black people were in and how they turned out and why they turned out that way. Things that we've just been lied to about. It's something that I hope that we all take from this, is that we have the ability to find out the truth. And once we find out that truth, we need to move accordingly and then pass on that truth.
This time right now that we have is that we are people. We do everything. If we just can stop and listen to one another and actually listen and learn about, each other and our cultures and our differences, you'll find that, there are some differences, but there are so much more similarities that we have as people here on this earth. We have so much more in common and so much more to worry about than skin color and gatekeeping and shape-shifting and just being scared to go outside because you don't know if when you get pulled over, if you're going to make it back home. That's what I want people to take away from this. Take strength away from this and be willing to listen to people and learn to love other people than someone who looks like you.
Driven family innovators, all of us older, we kicking, making it past 21, elevating for the placement. Now we sitting at the table, knowing that we all made it. I got real love. I got real love.
All the music on this episode were samples from Bartholomew's group Coffee Black. Make sure to find them on Spotify and hit that repeat button. Links and references will be updated on the podcast episode notes this weekend, January 6th. I want to give a special thanks to Lanisa, Stephen, Dre, and Bartholomew for their participation in this episode, for their willingness to share their stories and experiences with me, for being so open during such a painful time. It is such an honor for me to have the opportunity to hear you in this way. And to you, thank you for tuning in. And as always, and until next time, happy brewing.